Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the foundational architecture of emotional well-being. And we're doing that specifically through the lens of Daniel G. Amen's book, You, Happier, The 7 Neuroscience Secrets of Feeling Good Based on Your Brain Type.
And the core systemic question we are wrestling with here is one that I think really defines the modern emotional landscape. How is our emotional well-being, our happiness, our resilience, how is that fundamentally shaped by the brain's physical, biological systems?
The hardware.
Exactly, the measurable hardware, rather than it being solely dependent on psychological factors, attitude or mindset, which we so often treat as the only relevant software.
It is a critical inquiry, and one that is, frankly, urgently relevant right now. The data provided in the sources, it paints a really stark picture.
It's pretty grim.
Americans are reportedly the unhappiest they have been in 5 decades. And we've seen these explosive system breakdowns reflected in population health metrics. Just consider the data from the early pandemic months alone. Rates of depression nearly tripled.
Tripled? That number is staggering.
It went from about 8.5% to a truly horrifying 27.8%.
And this isn't just some abstract shift in the national mood, right? This is a visible structural failure. You can see the system straining under the weight of this distress.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the prescriptions. The dramatic, sustained increases in prescriptions for antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids. If widespread emotional distress could be solved simply by correcting one's attitude or just trying harder,
Right.
then these population-level crises and the pharmacological intervention that follows, they just wouldn't be necessary.
That's the key structural realization. This context reveals the hard limits of purely psychological explanations. If the brain is the physical organ that determines how we perceive, feel, and decide,
Then a crisis of perception or a crisis of happiness is first and foremost a crisis of biological function.
So our focus today is entirely on this system-level analysis. We are going to be dissecting the physical mechanics of brain function, blood flow, neurochemistry, all of it.
And it is absolutely crucial, based on the book's framework, to view these widespread mood problems as system failures or functional impairments. We have to explicitly decouple them from these old frameworks based on motivation or morality or, personal blame.
Okay, so let's unpack the foundation of this system. It really begins with a pretty profound paradigm shift in how we even observe the brain. We should introduce Daniel Amen and the evidence base behind these conclusions.
What's so fascinating here is that the conclusions aren't derived from, say, traditional talk therapy or self-reporting. They're derived from functional neuroscience data, and it's been collected on an unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
Dr. Amen is a psychiatrist who really pioneered the use of functional brain imaging in a clinical setting. His practice, Amen Clinics, has amassed the world's largest database of functional brain scans relating to behavior.
And when we talk about large scale, what do we mean? This isn't a small study.
Not at all. We mean over 200,000 SPECT scans. These are collected on patients from over 155 countries.
Wow. And what does that volume of data allow him to do that, say, traditional psychiatry, which is based solely on observable symptom checklists? What does it allow him to do that the old model cannot?
Well, the sheer volume of data allows for pattern recognition on a systemic level. It moves the entire discipline away from this generic symptom diagnosis.
Like you have depression.
Exactly. It moves it toward a functional diagnosis. By observing 200,000 brains in distress, he could start to categorize psychiatric issues like depression, anxiety, ADHD into highly specific subtypes based on unique, measurable biological patterns. And that's the foundation upon which this whole book rests.
Okay, and this framework relies on SPECT imaging. We absolutely have to clarify this because it seems like it's the key that unlocks the system's secrets. What is SPECT actually measuring?
Right. So SPECT, or single photon emission computed tomography, it's essential because it measures function, not just structure. A traditional MRI or a CT scan that's looking at the brain's anatomy.
The physical shape.
The physical shape, yeah.
Yeah.
Does it have a tumor? Is there bleeding?
Huh.
But SPECT looks at the engine while it's running. It visualizes blood flow and activity patterns in real time.
So it's not showing us the geography of the brain. It's showing us the traffic flow, where the energy is going, where the engine might be overheating, and where it's starved for fuel.
Precisely. It allows us to categorize brain activity as healthy, underactive, meaning low blood flow, or overactive, with too much blood flow. And this shift in visibility, that is the central thesis. It leads directly to the core argument of the book. Happiness is hardware dependent.
So the central thesis, the systemic view, is that happiness, resilience, emotional stability, they're all profoundly dependent on physical brain health.
Hmm.
And that many mood disorders are best understood not as character flaws or moral failings, but as biological system failures, functional impediments.
And if we just accept that the brain is the organ of decision-making, judgment, and motivation, then the quality of those decisions, which, are the common denominator of happiness and success, is dictated by that organ's functional health.
So if the decision-making apparatus is impaired by, say, low blood flow or overactivity in a critical region,
Then the behavioral output of that system will inevitably be compromised. And that's regardless of the individual's intention or their motivation.
that reframes the entire concept of personal struggle. It's not a moral failing, it's an architectural challenge.
Absolutely. And to appreciate these system failures, we first need a clear map of the architecture we're even talking about. The book uses this really effective analogy of the brain as an ancient city.
An ancient city.
Yeah, built in 3 foundational layers. Each layer performs essential, but sometimes competing functions.
Okay, let's start at the base then. The most ancient layer built for survival, the reptilian brain.
This is the foundation. It comprises the brainstem and the cerebellum. And its role is really simple and it's non-negotiable. It coordinates survival functions.
Breathing, heart rate.
Exactly. Motor coordination, breathing, heart rate, temperature regulation. But crucially, for mood, this system is involved in the essential production of key regulatory neurochemicals, including dopamine and serotonin. Its primary job is just ensuring you survive and move efficiently.
Okay, so moving up a layer, we get to the limbic system. This is the emotional core, the part that colors all our experiences.
The limbic system is the powerhouse of emotion and memory. It's what tags incoming information, determining if something is a threat or a reward. It manages critical survival needs like bonding, nesting, memory formation that happens in the hippocampus. And it's the engine for our urges, our cravings, our pleasure response, which is the basal ganglia.
And because it's so old, evolutionarily speaking, its influence is deep.
It's deep, it's automatic, and it's often entirely unconscious. It's frequently driving behavior before the conscious mind even has a chance to catch up.
And then the newest, most expansive layer, the wrapper, so to speak, the cerebral cortex. This is where abstract thought, language, and culture live.
And within that cortex, the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is the CEO of the brain.
The executive.
The executive. It's the seat of high-level function. Judgment, foresight, planning, impulse control, empathy, learning from mistakes. It's the structure that's responsible for mediating those powerful primitive urges coming from the limbic system. It lets us pursue long-term goals over immediate gratification. That CEO function is what allows for complex social interaction and really sustained happiness.
So when we combine these layers, the research started to identify specific functional circuits that were most integral to the subjective experience of joy. Biologically, the pursuit of happiness seems to be mapped to 3 interacting areas.
That's right. The 3 key players are, first, the orbital frontal cortex, which is the underside of the PFC, involved in judging rewards and consequences. Second is the basal ganglia nucleus accumbens, the critical reward center responsible for that feeling of pleasure.
And anticipation.
And anticipation, yes. And third, the brainstem, which is where many of the raw materials for happiness, the neurotransmitters, are actually manufactured. When these 3 areas are in functional alignment and show healthy activity, happiness tends to follow.
This finding is so central to the argument because it connects subjective experience directly to the objective system data. Let's talk about the Amen Clinic study on 344 patients. They correlated functional state scans with scores on the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire. What did those scans tell us about the happy brain versus the unhappy brain?
The contrast was profound, and it provided measurable evidence for this system design model, the high happiness group. Their scans showed overall increased blood flow and activity.
Which just speaks to generalized brain health.
Right, a healthy system. But critically, they showed heightened activity in the orbital prefrontal cortex and even more significantly, in those basal ganglia reward circuits.
So the system design dictated the emotional outcome. A robust, well-fueled system with optimized reward processing correlates directly with higher happiness scores. The hardware is actively set up for success.
Now look at the other side of the coin. The low happiness group showed a really distinctive functional pattern. Increased activity in one specific area, the anterior cingulate gyrus, or ACG.
Okay, the ACG, the book calls it the brain's gear shifter.
Or its internal error detection system. It's what allows you to shift attention from one thought to the next. It helps you notice when something is wrong or inconsistent.
But if it's an error detector, why is overactivity in that gear shifter associated with unhappiness?
Because it becomes a biological limitation. It constrains your cognitive flexibility. When the ACG is hyperactive, it gets stuck. It just keeps shifting the cognitive gears, but it's focusing relentlessly on perceived errors, negative outcomes, worry.
So you're stuck in a loop.
You're stuck in a loop. This structural pattern means these individuals are significantly more likely to get stuck on negative thoughts, to ruminate, to fall into cycles of chronic worry and perfectionism. They can't easily shift away from a negative loop, no matter how much they consciously try to think positive. The system defaults to fixation.
Wow. So we are truly seeing the brain prioritize fixation and pattern matching over cognitive flexibility in the low happiness group. And that's a functional impediment that no amount of pure willpower can just override.
Exactly. When the hardware is stuck, the software commands, like stop worrying, are often useless. The brain is constrained by its biology. And this brings us to the next critical layer, the upstream drivers that dictate the functional capacity of these systems.
This is secret two from the book, which states that optimizing the physical functioning of your brain is the foundational requirement. If the hardware is damaged or running inefficiently, everything else fails. The book uses the Bright Minds mnemonic to organize these system drivers, and I think we should spend some real time detailing the mechanisms behind each one.
Let's do it. Starting with B, blood flow. It seems so simple, but blood flow is the lifeblood of the brain's functional capacity. The brain consumes 20% to 30% of the body's oxygen and calories.
Despite being only 2% of our body weight.
It's an incredibly demanding organ.
So if the brain is that metabolically demanding, low blood flow is functionally equivalent to starving the system.
That is the perfect analogy. Low blood flow starves neurons, makes them sluggish, leads to system underactivity, especially in those critical executive regions like the PFC. Research links low blood flow directly to depression, ADHD, and, this is frightening, it's cited as the #1 predictor of future Alzheimer's risk.
But the good news is that blood vessel health is dynamic.
Absolutely. When you improve blood flow through exercise, nitric oxide boosters, certain supplements, you are measurably increasing the functional capacity of the system, and that directly increases happiness scores. The health of your vascular system is just paramount for long-term emotional stability.
Okay, next, the H-head trauma, TBI. This is where the failure of conventional assessment is just so glaring. The symptoms of TBI often mirror psychological distress, and that can lead to years of misdiagnosis.
This is a profound example of system damage being misinterpreted as a character flaw. The book mentions a case study of a patient named Stephen.
Right.
Stephen had suffered a lifetime of profound sadness, chronic anxiety, dark, intrusive thoughts. He'd been through years of therapy but found no lasting relief because everyone was addressing the software problem.
But what did his functional scan reveal about the hardware?
His SPECT scan showed severe system damage. There was low blood flow in his prefrontal cortex, impairing his judgment and impulse control, and also damage in the temporal and occipital lobes.
And what was the cause?
Well, when they took a detailed history, they uncovered a seemingly minor childhood fall. He was knocked unconscious, but the injury was never addressed. Decades later, that initial physical system damage, that biological constraint, was still dictating a lifetime of psychological outcomes.
The system damage was effectively invisible to the traditional model that just relies on self-reported symptoms.
Exactly. Undiagnosed brain injuries are now acknowledged as this massive, often hidden, contributing factor to chronic depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide risk. The system was functionally impaired by blunt force trauma years earlier, but the resulting depression was treated as a failure of personality.
But the brain is plastic. It can recover.
It's incredibly resilient. The study on retired NFL players, many of whom had severe functional damage, showed that 80% of them saw significant improvement in blood flow, mood, and cognitive function after they implemented this targeted Bright Minds program. The system, though damaged, is dynamic and recoverable, even long after the initial trauma.
Okay, moving on to I for inflammation. The book calls this a low-level fire. We understand inflammation in our joints, but how does this systemic driver translate into an emotional system failure in the brain?
Chronic systemic inflammation leads to a cascade of functional problems. It ultimately increases the risk of depression and dementia. Inflammation releases these destructive molecules called cytokines. And these cytokines can cross the blood-brain barrier, that's the protective shield around the brain, and they can interfere with neurotransmitter synthesis and function. They basically gum up the complex neurochemical communication system.
So inflammation is directly degrading the efficiency of the emotional hardware. What are some of the surprising structural causes of this inflammation that the book highlights?
Well, beyond the obvious, the inflammatory standard American diet, high in sugar and processed oils, two specific biological pathways are cited as major, often overlooked drivers. The first is gum disease.
Gum disease, really?
Yes, periodontitis. Gum disease is a chronic infection that results in a low-level, continuous release of cytokines into the bloodstream.
So an unresolved dental issue is functionally communicating danger and inflammation directly to the brain's mood centers.
Precisely. It's a systemic biological constraint that originates completely outside the brain. Dr. Amen noted that seeing this research fundamentally changed his own behavior. He became religious about flossing because he realized the systemic link between oral hygiene and PFC function.
Wow. And what was the second critical input?
Low omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3s are essential building blocks for healthy brain cell membranes.
And the sources note that a startling 97% of the population has suboptimal levels of omega-3s. That's a huge systemic issue.
It's a massive nutritional system failure. Omega-3s, particularly DHA, are required for the structure and flexibility of those membranes. Higher levels of omega-3s correlate with healthier hippocampi, the memory and mood center. A deficiency makes the cell membranes stiff and inefficient, which hinders effective neurochemical signaling.
Okay, and then there's the gut, the second brain. How does that connect to inflammation and mood?
Well, about 75% of the body's neurotransmitters, including a vast majority of serotonin, are actually manufactured in the gut. The gut houses the enteric nervous system, which is loaded with nervous tissue. So gut problems, dysbiosis, inflammation, they directly impair the production and regulation of these essential mood chemicals.
So if your factory for serotonin is unhealthy,
Then your brain, regardless of its intention, will lack the raw materials for stability. Correcting gut health with the right diet and probiotics is a foundational step in systemic mood improvement.
let's move to M for mental health issues and the corresponding stress hormones. This feels like the ultimate negative feedback loop, the environment damaging the physical system.
It is the cycle of self-perpetuation. Exposure to chronic external stress raises cortisol, which the book calls the molecule of danger. And the danger is very real. Sustained, high-level cortisol exposure has been shown to be neurotoxic. It leads to the measurable shrinkage of the hippocampi.
So an external input relentless stress is physically degrading the internal biological infrastructure that's responsible for mood, resilience, and memory.
The unhappy system isn't just depressed. It's measurably smaller in critical regions. This is why treating mental health issues, reducing stress, interrupting this negative feedback loop, it's crucial to preserving the physical brain structure itself. Happier people, by definition, have lower cortisol levels, and that protects their brain architecture.
Okay, the mnemonic continues with N for neurohormone deficiencies and D for diabesity, a fusion of diabetes and obesity, both of which severely compromise blood flow and increase inflammation. But let's focus on T for toxins. Given the brain's metabolic needs, it seems highly vulnerable to damaging inputs.
Toxins are insidious system disruptors. Exposure to common environmental toxins, heavy metals, even hidden mold can cause measurable damage to the metabolically active brain
And I
and the resulting system failures. They manifest as depression, anxiety, brain fog, chronic irritability.
And this is often an undetected root cause.
Completely. Traditional psychiatric evaluation rarely screens for mold or heavy metal exposure. The prescription here is intense vigilance over your external inputs, from food to personal care products, because the brain is so susceptible to this kind of metabolic poisoning.
This all brings us back to that empowering principle of neuroplasticity. We are not stuck with the brain we have. I mean, the author provides his own compelling data. A bumpy, toxic-looking scan at age 37.
Transformed into a much healthier, more symmetrical scan at age 62 after implementing these system-based principles. The hardware is dynamic.
It just emphasizes that the brain isn't a static object. It's a system that is constantly adapting to its inputs.
And by actively managing the inputs listed in Bright Minds, improving blood flow, reducing inflammation, managing stress, avoiding toxins, you are engaging in active system reconfiguration. You're re-engineering the system, and that directly leads to measurable improvements in function and inherently to greater resilience and happiness.
Okay, so the Bright Minds mnemonic gives us the universal inputs for optimal system health. But now we have to discuss Secret 1, the principle of system refinement. The data showed that a generic, one-size-fits-all approach to happiness will fail. Why?
Because different brains have fundamentally different functional patterns. That is the ultimate lesson of those 200,000 SPECT scans. The concept of brain types is based on observable functional patterns of activity and neurochemistry. An intervention that calms one type of overactivity might actually worsen a problem of underactivity in another.
So you have to target the system engineering based on these unique patterns.
You have to.
Okay, let's map the 5 primary functional types, starting with the ideal baseline, the balanced brain type.
This functional pattern shows full, even, and symmetrical activity. It's an indicator of optimal blood flow, balanced neurochemicals. Their systems are configured to handle stress effectively. So for them, the strategy for happiness is really just maintenance.
Avoiding the bad stuff.
Avoiding known system degraders like alcohol, high sugar, chronic stress. They have the optimal hardware for navigating life's complexities.
Then we have the spontaneous brain type. Where is the architectural challenge for them?
They typically show lower activity in the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, the brain CEO. This underactivity is often associated with higher levels of dopamine, which is the molecule of more.
The drive for novelty and reward.
Exactly. Novelty, reward, impulsive action. The functional pattern is one of brilliance and creativity, but the system constraint is a lack of effective braking power. The CEO is asleep at the wheel, which leads to challenges with focus, follow-through, and impulse control.
So interventions for this type have to be engineered to boost the executive function of the PFC, to put a check on those powerful limbic urges.
Precisely. Next, the persistent brain type, which is characterized by that relentless overactive gear shifter, the ACG.
This is the system pattern that traps the individual in those negative cycles we talked about.
Yes. They show increased activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus, which links to lower serotonin levels. And serotonin is the molecule of respect, which governs flexibility and adaptability. This biological limitation translates into behaviors like chronic doubt, argumentative behavior, holding grudges, and behavioral inflexibility.
They get stuck.
They get stuck in routines or chronic worry. The Bruce Lee quote in the book is structurally perfect here. The stiffest tree is most easily cracked. This brain architecture resists bending, which makes resilience difficult. Their system is optimized by dependable routines and requires intentional interventions to encourage cognitive shifting.
Then we encounter the sensitive brain type whose vulnerability is located deeper in the limbic system.
They exhibit increased activity in the deep limbic system, which makes them highly vulnerable to sadness, moodiness, negativity. This pattern is associated with neurochemicals like oxytocin and endorphins. They're often highly empathetic.
But their limbic vulnerability means perceived slights or failures hit harder.
They hit harder and they last longer. Overactivity in this area can even impact bonding and sexual desire, which further compounds their emotional isolation by limiting the release of those feel-good bonding neurochemicals.
And finally, the cautious brain type. Here, the primary system constraint is fear and chronic anxiety.
This type shows heightened activity in the key anxiety centers. The amygdala, which is the brain's smoke detector, constantly signaling danger, and the basal ganglia. The functional problem is a system that is constantly on high alert, even when it's safe. Their system engineering has to focus on calming that limbic system and restoring a sense of safety and predictability.
So understanding these measurable functional patterns lets us transition directly into Secret 3, nourishing your unique brain with targeted nutraceutical inputs. This frames supplementation not as vague self-help, but as precise system engineering to correct a measured imbalance.
The shift in perception is profound. The book argues that nutraceutical supplements with medicinal, evidence-based effects should be foundational because they're often low cost and they directly provide the building blocks the system needs.
And we're not talking about fringe science.
No, we are talking about compounds like omega-3s, vitamin D, precursors for neurotransmitters, all backed by extensive scientific literature.
And the key is targeting the input based on the measured type. How does the chemistry of these inputs relate to the functional pattern?
Okay, take the spontaneous type, whose PFC is underactive. They lack focus and impulse control, so they need to boost dopamine function. L-tyrosine is a critical input here because it's an amino acid, a direct precursor to dopamine. By supplementing the raw materials, you are directly engineering the capacity for the PFC to function better.
And what about for the persistent type, struggling with lower serotonin and that ACG overactivity?
They need the raw material for serotonin. 5-HTP, or 5-hydroxytryptophan, is a precursor to serotonin. By supplementing with 5-HTP, you are providing the foundational chemicals needed to increase serotonin availability, which helps increase cognitive flexibility and calm that overactive gear shifter.
And the cautious type.
With their overactive anxiety centers, they benefit from calming agents. things like GABA or magnesium, which are crucial for slowing down the overly firing neurons in the amygdala. This moves the whole conversation from generic advice to precise system configuration.
This theme continues with Secret 4. Happy foods versus sad foods, framing dietary inputs as system regulators. The quality of our food is directly proportional to our system function.
Diet dictates system function at the cellular level. Sad foods, the highly processed, sugary, inflammatory standard American diet, are system degraders. They cause the systemic inflammation we talked about, they compromise blood flow, and they increase depression risk. They actively work against optimal brain function.
Conversely, happy foods perform specific biological functions that enhance the system's capacity for joy and resilience.
They are critical system inputs.
Yeah.
Happy foods are, engineered by nature to boost blood flow by promoting nitric oxide production, which dilates vessels and fuels the brain. They actively increase stem cell production in the hippocampus, physically supporting the area critical for mood and memory.
And they boost BDNF.
Exactly. They boost BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which acts like fertilizer for the brain. It enhances plasticity, learning, and resilience against stress. Diet isn't just about weight. It is a fundamental lever for optimizing the system hardware.
Okay, finally, let's discuss the critical interlink between hardware and software in Secret 5. Mastering your mind. This is the cognitive feedback loop. It illustrates how thought patterns become powerful biological inputs that either degrade or enhance the system.
It's the ultimate connection. Negative thoughts. They're not just harmless internal monologues. They are measurable system stressors. Sustained negative thought patterns raise stress hormones like cortisol, they deplete feel-good neurotransmitters, and they suppress the immune system. This biological reaction makes you physically feel anxious, depressed, and unwell.
While positive, accurate thinking does the opposite.
It does the opposite, releasing dopamine and serotonin, which calms the body and reinforces PFC function.
So the subjective experience of a thought has immediate, measurable physical consequences that then feed right back into the system's functional capacity. It's a closed loop.
And here is the core structural challenge. The brain's prehistoric default setting is negativity. It evolved to prioritize scanning for danger and survival, not perpetual contentment. So we are biologically prone to these negative loops.
So to counteract that tendency, we have to employ intentional, accurate thinking with a positive spin.
But the vicious cycle is severe. Chronic negative thoughts degrade PFC function. They decrease its activity, which in turn makes clear decision-making, foresight, and impulse control even harder.
It's the ultimate functional impairment. Stress impairs the CEO, the PFC, so you make decisions that generate more stress, which further degrades the system. This biological limitation is precisely why being told to just think positive is so insufficient, maybe even cruel, if the underlying ACG is hyperactive and stuck on a negative loop due to measurable physical constraints.
So moving into the broader implications, this neuroscientific view exposes major structural misalignments in our modern approach to mental health. And this is central to the mission of crisis in perception.
The biggest gap, and it's emphasized repeatedly in the sources, is the absence of biological screening. The lack of visibility into the hardware is the fundamental flaw in the current system of mental health care delivery.
We routinely screen the heart with EKGs, bones with X-rays, specific glands with blood tests. It's standard of care. Yet, functional brain imaging SPECT, or EEG, is rarely, if ever, standard practice in conventional medicine or traditional psychiatry.
So the system relies entirely on behavioral checklists.
Which leads to diagnosis by symptom aggregation, not functional cause. We are treating outcomes without ever looking at the organ of origin. The author suggests that standardized functional screening should just be part of a physical after age 50 or earlier if symptoms dictate.
This lack of visibility feeds directly into the cultural problem we could call the willpower trap, the over-reliance on motivation-based advice.
The book forces a distinction between will-driven behavior, simple effort or attitude, and brain-driven behavior, which is a demonstrable biological constraint. If a person struggles with irritability and poor judgment because they have undiagnosed low blood flow in their PFC from years of poor diet telling them to be nicer or try harder, just ignores the physical reality.
Right. It's like asking a car with a flat tire to win a race by just having a better attitude.
Exactly. Or if a person has, and I'm quoting, a hot limbic system that you inherited, They may require targeted biological intervention, nutraceuticals, bright light therapy, specific medication to cool that system down before talk therapy can even begin to be effective.
Let's illustrate the structural misalignment with a concrete scenario. How would traditional psychiatry approach generalized anxiety, and how would a SPECT-informed neurobiological approach differ for, say, a cautious brain type?
Okay, so traditional psychiatry, lacking visibility into the hardware, would rely heavily on something like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It focuses on restructuring thought patterns, challenging catastrophic assumptions. It's a software solution.
Using willpower to change the narrative.
Exactly. Using willpower to change the narrative. And it can work, but you're fighting an upstream current.
Because the cautious type system has an overactive amygdala, constantly firing that fear signal.
Precisely. The SPECT-informed approach starts by acknowledging that biological constraint. It says, your amygdala is overactive, your smoke detector is faulty. So the intervention is targeted system engineering. First, calm the amygdala with inputs like magnesium, GABA, or targeted medication to physically dampen the excessive firing. Then, once the system is calmer,
Then you introduce the cognitive restructuring.
then you bring in the CBT. You move the patient from a state of biological constraint to one of biological capacity, and that's what makes the software changes finally possible.
This exposes the deeply ingrained cultural misunderstanding and stigma around mood disorders. The traditional narrative reframes a functional impediment like low blood flow or ACG overactivity as a personal weakness or a moral failing.
But when you view depression as a functional impairment, the narrative changes entirely. It removes that unnecessary moral weight. It is no longer you are unmotivated or lazy, but rather your organ of motivation and decision-making is struggling due to chronic inflammation or lack of blood flow. This biological framing provides immense relief and clarity, shifting the focus from blame to repair.
And this connects explicitly back to the core themes of crisis and perception, the tension between structural systems and individual blame.
The research consistently demonstrates that happiness is supported by measurable physical states, lower cortisol, reduced inflammation, and better executive function from the PFC. When structural issues, the standard American diet, chronic external stress, toxin exposure, directly impair this functional capacity, it is a structural system failure.
And the persistent cultural impulse to label this suffering as a failure of willpower is really a cognitive shortcut.
It's a shortcut that allows society to ignore the measurable physical constraints and absolve itself of the responsibility of creating healthier environments and screening processes.
So, if we choose to treat mental health primarily as a purely psychological issue, we remain structurally misaligned with the biological reality of the brain. And that leads to systemic misdiagnosis and an over-reliance on motivation-based treatments that just can't overcome physical constraints.
The book serves as a powerful argument for the non-negotiable integration of biology and psychology. It insists that measurable physical inputs and biological integrity dictate the functional capacity of the system we use to navigate and experience the world.
So, if we step back and look at this entire deep dive, what does You Happier help us see differently about the system of emotional well-being?
It fundamentally reframes happiness as a cultivated state. It's deeply dependent on the physical integrity and optimal function of the brain system. It's not some gift reserved for the genetically fortunate. It is a measurable, engineered state. We have a profound biological responsibility to treat the physical organ of happiness right, because its health determines our capacity for joy.
And by doing so, it recontextualizes mental health problems, moving them away from the abstract, purely psychological realm and firmly into the biological sphere.
The shift is powerful. Issues like chronic anxiety and depression are presented as measurable, often preventable, and frequently treatable functional problems. Even years after damage, as we saw with the recovery of patients with decades-old head trauma, the functional scans prove that the problem isn't invisible. It's a visible functional pattern that requires targeted engineering.
The ultimate takeaway seems to be the shift in our internal focus, from focusing on responsibility to focusing on capacity.
Absolutely. The structural shift moves us away from the self-blaming question, why am I failing, to the essential system management question. Is this input, this diet, this relationship, this lack of sleep, good for my brain or bad for it? This restores agency by emphasizing the power of managing inputs to improve fundamental biological capacity. When the capacity increases, resilience and happiness follow as a natural output.
Here's a thought for you to contemplate as we wrap up. If the physical health of the brain determines the quality of our decisions, our judgment, our impulse control, empathy, and foresight, and if the brain is constantly being degraded by widespread structural issues like the standard American diet, chronic stress, and pervasive environmental toxins, then how much of the systemic chaos in the world, from political polarization to widespread incivility and short-sighted policy, is merely a measurable reflection of collective biologically impaired decision-making?
That is the structural crisis in perception this analysis illuminates. The personal quest for optimizing the physical hardware of happiness may indeed be the necessary precursor to solving systemic global problems that stem from impaired judgment.
We have been exploring Daniel G. Amen's book, You Happier, The 7 Neuroscience Secrets of Feeling Good Based on Your Brain Type. We encourage you to read it or borrow it from a library to explore the concepts in depth.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.